Greetings, and welcome to Universal University, Episode 0. My name is Labtekwon, aka Dr. Omar Akbar. Today, we'll introduce you to the purpose of Universal University, as well as our theoretical framework for both pedagogy and scholarship. It is an honor to carry on the legacy of our ancestors in the service of future generations. Let's not waste any time. Let's get right to it. The Akbar Think Tank presents Universal University. Before we proceed with our introduction to Universal University, I think it would be a good idea just to share what exactly is the Akbar Think Tank. Simply put, the Akbar Think Tank is a means by which like-minded people can come together to develop problem-solving strategies for Black folks globally. So, the first question that we should answer is, what is Universal University? Well, to define Universal University, it is best for us to offer the purpose of Universal University. Essentially, it's an online resource to continue the tradition of Black studies into the 21st century. It's also an opportunity to provide scholarly content from the perspective of Black globalism / Black social theory, which we'll get into a little bit more as we go along. But we also want to examine, deconstruct, critique paradigms and systems that affect humanity as a whole. And finally, we want to provide the viewer with bibliographies of verifiable primary, secondary, and tertiary sources so they will be able to continue their own research and study beyond the lectures that we provide. Black globalism equals Black social theory. In the social sciences, oftentimes what seem like common terms are used in ways that have different definitions depending on who's using those terms. So we'll provide our theoretical definitions for these terms so that you'll have a clear understanding of what we mean when we use these terms in Universal University. Some of the primary paradigms and terms that we will define and analyze include the paradigm of white supremacy, the Kunta Kinte-Toby dichotomy, and Black social theory / Black globalism. We'll be providing a macro and micro analysis of race, meaning on the macro level, we'll look at the larger systems and thought processes that drive society. On a micro level, we'll look at those thought processes as they affect individuals. And finally, we'll provide an introduction to pioneers of Black globalism. Universal University's primary theoretical framework is Black social theory. But let's define some terms. What is social theory? Social theory refers to ideas, arguments, hypotheses, thought experiments, and explanatory speculations about how and why human societies or elements or structures of such societies come to be formed, change, and develop over time or disappear. Usually supported in research institutions as a core component of the discipline of sociology, social theory most commonly encompasses the range of explanatory concepts, analytical tools, and heuristic devices on which sociologists and social scientists draw in their efforts to interpret statistical or qualitative data about particular empirical and social phenomena. Now, from this definition of social theory, we have a very strong foundation to explain exactly what we're attempting to do at Universal University. Albeit that this definition provided by Oxford Bibliographies is quite comprehensive, it should also be noted that social theory can be applied to any of the social sciences or the humanities, and this includes history, psychology, pedagogy, or any discipline that involves problem solving as it relates to human beings. In this regard, when we explain what we mean by Black social theory, it is still within the range and function of all social theory. Now, what does Black mean? As you can see here in this slide, we have Black as a proper adjective with a capital B, the inequation sign, and Black as an adjective with a lowercase b. So we separate these two definitions and terms by very clearly stating what we mean when we use them. In the contemporary context, Black as a proper adjective, or with a capital B, defines people who are descendants of formerly enslaved and colonized African people globally who also reject the paradigm of white supremacy in both mind and action. Now, we'll also define white supremacy in a few moments, but let's continue. In the historical sense, black as a proper adjective with a capital B describes the ancestors of African people globally who resisted the hegemony of European imperialism and white supremacy after 1492. In the context of aesthetics and genetics, black is a description of those with high concentrations of eumelanin or melanin in the epidermis, in addition to other dominant phenotypic traits associated with indigenous African people, and that can include wide nasal index, breadth of lips, keratin dense hair, etc. It's important to note that in the human population, there are many diverse groups that also share some of these phenotypic traits all over the planet Earth. So that is why it is important that we delineate between the proper adjective black and the lowercase description or adjective black as being two different concepts. One is simply describing an appearance that's associated with indigenous African people. The proper adjective is focusing on a way of thinking. And this goes back to an old African American saying, all skin folk ain't kinfolk. So when we make this statement about skinfolk and kinfolk, we say kinfolk are those that are like-minded, whereas skinfolk may be people that share these phenotypic traits. But it is important to understand that although phenotype is an important element of understanding who we are, it is not the defining form of who we are. As been said many times in the past, mind over matter. This process eliminates confusion of defining a population and defining a community. A community has shared interest, shared values, shared semiotics, shared epistemology, shared ontology, shared axiology. A population has shared characteristics. In other words, you can have a population of males. That population share the characteristic of an XY chromosome. But it does not mean that they have the same beliefs. It does not mean that they have the same cultural practices. It does not mean they have the same value systems. They are simply a population with a shared characteristic. Whereas a community, for example, let's say there's a community of chess players at a local university. That community has a common union in the practice of playing chess, and that is something that they share as a value. What we're demonstrating with these definitions is that black as a proper adjective represents a shared way of thinking amongst a population of people that have shared characteristics. But absence of this shared way of thinking, there is no community. There is simply a population. This aspect of black social theory and black globalism is nuanced and extremely important in understanding our analysis. Again, all skinfolk ain't kinfolk. Therefore, we define the collective as those with a shared way of thinking. We are not just describing physical characteristics. Now, this particular concept is probably one of the most controversial. What does white supremacy mean? Racism equals white supremacy. So let's be clear. Again, these are the theoretical definitions for universal university. In no way does it imply or suggest that so-called white people are, quote, supreme. The term in and of itself describes a paradigm which has been implemented in the macro of systems and institutions in society, as well as in the micro interpersonal relationships that occur in society. Using this terminology does not mean we advocate or in any way believe the validity of the idea. However, to deconstruct the concept, we must first make an assessment and identify the concept. White supremacy, which is a synonym for racism, is a pseudoscientific paradigm that proposes an intellectual, cultural, social, moral hierarchy in the human species based on the claim that phenotypic traits are the causative variable for all human potential and behavior. In this hierarchy, those with minimal concentrations of melanin in the epidermis, so-called white people, are somehow at the apex of human development and potential, and those with increasing degrees of epidermal melanin are ranked below, with so-called black as the lowest. Now, in simple terms, what this means is that based on your appearance or your phenotype, the color of your skin will dictate your level of intelligence, the potential for developing civilization, your ability to use any form of critical thinking, thinking, reasoning, or even the ability to have a high level of morality. This, of course, is not backed by any authentic form of science. Nevertheless, according to one of our great ancestors, Neely Fuller Jr., white supremacy is currently a hegemony, or a power structure that has great control over 9 areas of human activity. 1. Economics. 2. Education. 3. Entertainment. 4. Labor. 5. Law. 6. Politics. 7. Religion. 8. Sex. 9. War and counter-war. This construct of race, aka white supremacy, was introduced by a person by the name of Carl Linnaeus in his 1734 work, System of Nature. And as you can see here on this slide, what Linnaeus essentially does, he makes this assessment that the phenotypic traits of human beings is the causative factor in determining their cultural patterns, social patterns, and their intellectual potential. In doing so, he also creates a hierarchy. And at the top of this hierarchy, he considers European people as being the most evolved, most intelligent, and most capable human beings on the planet. And at the bottom of this hierarchy are those that are descendants of African people, whether on the continent of Africa or in the African diaspora. A significant aspect of Carl Linnaeus' work, which I think is important, he's categorizing human beings into a subspecies called Homo variant, which is really what we call race. And in doing so, as he names each of these groups that you can see in this particular slide, the names of the Homo variant, or what we call race, the names aren't the colors. The names are based on a geographic location. So each race is named by where they would be located primarily. So you have Eurapius albus, which is European, so-called white, as they're described. Americanus rubescens, and they're described as reddish. And then you have Asiaticus fuscus, which is so-called Asian people, and they're considered, quote, tawny or yellow. And then you have Africanus niger, which is African and black. So this is a very important thing to understand. This is not an opinion. This is literally from System of Nature, which was first published in 1734 and then was reintroduced several times by his son, Carl Linnaeus the Younger, and then was introduced in the United States into an English translation, which we see in the 19th century. But they clearly delineated that black is associated with Africa, and red is associated with America, and white is associated with Europe, and so-called yellow is associated with Asia. Now, this is from 1734. So when we talk about the construct of race and white supremacy, there was no question that so-called black people were from Africa. And again, this is in 1734, prior to the formation of the United States, prior to the 19th century. This was almost 100 years before that. But it's quite significant that the construct of race is not named black, white, red, yellow. It is named after the continents that these populations are said to have originated from. Now, throughout the Age of Enlightenment, we saw a wave of early white supremacist ideas that carry on to this day. On this slide right here, we go through a timeline. We see 1748, David Hume, he writes the essay of National Character. He claims black people had no achievements in history, just savage and barbaric. 1749, George Buffon says the same in his Histoire Naturelle. He says that white people were actually the original humans and black people were somehow a degenerated version. As we move on, we get to 1764. We see the infamous Immanuel Kant, who wrote the essay called Observations of the Beautiful and Sublime. Now, his claim is similar to the others. He says black people had no civilizations in all history, and this will be significant when we get to the next slide. In the same year, 1764, we see another famous European philosopher, this guy, Francois Voltaire, who published the Dictionary of Philosophy. He claimed that the so-called Negro was cursed with ugliness and inferiority. And then he went on to extend something that was used by the Holy Roman Empire called the chain of being, which essentially he ranks life forms with Europeans at the top and then Negroes below and then monkeys and then oysters. In 1849, Robert Knox, he wrote something called The Races of Man, and he claimed that non-whites had been slaves to so-called white folks since the beginning of time. That in and of itself is another example of how this dogma, how this paradigm, which is a real thing now, because if, people believe something and then they act on that thought process, then it becomes a reality. Not that the idea is rooted in fact, but the behaviors that manifest, those are real. So the thing about this particular claim is that it defies history in and of itself. Just on a simple timeline, Europeans did not circumnavigate the globe until much, much later. They didn't even really start leaving the subcontinent of so-called Europe until around the 15th century. They traversed sometimes to the Mediterranean. You had Marco Polo go to Asia. But when we're talking about mass migration of so-called Europeans, that doesn't happen until after the 15th century. So for those thousands and thousands of years, how can the claim be made that so-called non-white people had always been slaves to so-called white folks since the beginning of time? So by 1853, you have Arthur Gabineau, who writes the essay Inequality of the Human Races. And this is significant. He says a lot of the same stuff as the rest, but he also theorizes that Germans, and at that time it was called Prussia, but in any event, he theorizes that Germans were descended from so-called Aryan peoples, and because of that, they were superior. Now, this is problematic for several reasons, mainly because when you say Aryan, you're talking about a population of people that in the Bronze Age, at least, we're talking about ancient Iran and perhaps even parts of the subcontinent of India and Afghanistan. That region doesn't have a population of people that have blonde hair and blue eyes. That's more Scandinavian. So again, this is just another example of how to deconstruct this paradigm by going to the sources and looking at particular concept of so-called white supremacy was introduced and implemented at the institutional levels as well as throughout the educational systems in Europe and in the United States. Another interesting aspect of this dogma of white supremacy is the Caucasian theory. And a lot of times folks have used the term Caucasians to describe so-called white folks. And most of the time, there hasn't been really a lot of folks that have determined what is the authenticity of that claim to say that so-called white folks are from the Caucasus Mountains. This will clear up some of that in terms of exactly where the word Caucasian came from as it was applied to describe so-called white folks. So in 1795, a German by the name of Johann Blumenbach publishes the third edition of his work on the natural variety of mankind. He also develops a racial hierarchy similar to Linnaeus, but instead of using the category Eurapius, he uses the term Caucasian, which is meant to denote white folks. And that is also in a hierarchical form. It's the primary group. And then it's followed by Mongoloid, which are so-called Asian people or yellow people. And then Ethiopian, which is typically African people, so-called black people. Malay, which is parts of Asia like the Philippines and Malaysia, of course, which are typically what he associates with brown people. And then American, which he considers red, which is typically associated with Native Americans. But he also has a unique perspective where he says Native Americans in the American Northwest are in the Mongoloid category, while the Native Americans in the rest of the United States are in the American category, which is an interesting analysis just because of the levels of inconsistency that it represents. Fortunately, we have the usage of genetics now so that we can clear up pseudoscience that we see in the early development of racial classifications from these Europeans. Blumenbach also shifted away from Carl Linnaeus' geographic categorization to the usage of a morphology, which is basically like the study of form in an organism. And he used the discovery of skulls found in the Caucasus Mountains to develop a thesis on the so-called beauty of the white race. He's dealing with aesthetics now. He's not talking about genetics. He's not even really dealing with science. He's purely considering this from a perspective of subjective standards of beauty. The European beauty standard attempted to be forced into a scientific framework. But what makes it even more pseudo-scientific is that he believed that all humans descended from the biblical figures Adam and Eve. And his assertion was that somehow those people in the Caucasus Mountains were the last remaining direct descendants of Adam and Eve. So he claims that original human beings are from the Caucasus Mountains, and he's saying that these people with recessive phenotypic traits, this pheomelanin or white skin, were somehow the original populations of humans, and all other versions of human beings phenotypically are a degenerative version. So essentially he's saying that the original humans are white as they gradually gain melanin some magical way, which I'll explain in a second. they became yellow, brown, black, and red. So he echoes some of the claims made by Buffon, and he states that non-white people were a degenerative version of the original white folks. And then he has this other thing, this concept called Bildungsstribe. Basically, he can't explain how the phenotypic traits of human beings can be so different. So he comes up with this concept that there's this formative drive in the womb that somehow causes the human phenotypic traits to manifest, but it's induced by environment. So this is absurdly incorrect on every level of scientific analysis. And it's important that we make that commentary because for a long time, this was the standard. And even today, when we look at certain census questions or even in the academy, people still use the term Caucasian. And in and of itself, it is not rooted in scientific fact. It is dogma. And the literature that it emanates from that introduces it into the vernacular of the academy is based on someone that thought all human beings came from a white Adam and Eve. So, again, this is just another example. The Caucasian theory, it's important that we understand even where that term comes from, that is not rooted in fact. That is rooted in dogma. Once we have access to modern science and we can look at genetics, we know that all of this is absolute nonsense. And that's a very significant point because this dominated scholarship for almost 200 years, as it were. Arguably, some people still try to hold on to these ideas as if they're rooted in fact. Well, let's move on. So that brings us to our next slide. People debate this and argue about this all the time in different ways. It's the concept of the Hamitic hypothesis and the new Hamitic hypothesis, right? Obviously, when you say Ham, we're talking about the biblical character that's a son of Noah. So the original Hamitic hypothesis that existed during the time that the Holy Roman Empire was still alive and kicking, the Hamitic hypothesis essentially argued that African people descended from the biblical character Ham, and they were cursed because Ham's descendants were cursed to be slaves because Ham saw his father Noah naked and he didn't cover up his father's nudity. The term is hermeneutics, right? It's how you choose to read what a biblical scripture really means. Within the construct of white supremacy, the Hamitic hypothesis initially suggests that black folks are meant to be slaves because of this curse, and it is God's will. Obviously, once you have, the 30 Years' War, 100 Years' War, Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, and then the decline of the Holy Roman Empire, and then you have this Age of Enlightenment where pseudoscience becomes Europe's new toy, this is more fluid. So by 1798, you have the new Hamitic hypothesis. Now, it's a new version of the old one, but it's totally different. Napoleon goes to Egypt in 1798, and obviously, a lot of these artifacts throughout the temples and pyramids and things of that nature demonstrate phenotypic traits of black folks, and that was problematic. Also, the population at that time, contrary to popular belief, there were still black folks, meaning phenotypically dark-skinned black folks. So they like to use this term sub-Saharan. It's another device of white supremacy to suggest that the Sahara was some type of magical barrier and black folks couldn't traverse it. We'll talk about that another time. But the point is once Napoleon gets there and he sees these artifacts and then this field of Egyptology is born, there's a big issue because of all of the propaganda that's been developing throughout this period of time, especially during the Age of Enlightenment and especially with the increase of chattel slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. Now you have a situation where you've been saying Africa has no civilization, African people have done nothing, and they're savage. And now you see that the civilization that is most advanced in the purview of Europeans is rooted in black folks. And some of those black folks that you despise are still there, and they exist on the walls of temples. They exist in statues. And this was a big problem. So they changed the rules about who Ham was. Now the new Hamitic hypothesis is that Ham represents some type of European person that magically came to Africa, gave them civilization, and then left. And now the one drop rule is thrown out the window because They attempted to do the same thing when the Ethiopians defeated the Italians in 1896 at the Battle of Adwa. They wanted to reclassify Ethiopians as Caucasian or Hamitic peoples that were not connected to so-called sub-Saharan Africans. So this is something you see in Egyptology. And even, there's always the internet debates about the phenotype of the original people of the Nile Valley. I mean, we can dismiss that. Black folks are the original people of the planet Earth, and we'll talk about that later in another lecture. But the founding idea of it is, when we analyze this objectively and rationally, we see that the depth of this paradigm of white supremacy is not rooted in any form of supremacy. It's actually a very weak intellectual perspective, and it's very easy to deconstruct. And our ancestors were quite capable of doing so. Now that we've kind of laid out some of these terms and ideas, we'll get deeper into understanding exactly how this actually manifests in problem-solving processes. So let's look at the remedy. First and foremost, the question that we should answer now that we've laid out these terms: what is Black social theory? So Black social theory is an analytical framework. It's for the purpose of deconstructing and rejecting the paradigm of white supremacy and its praxis of capitalism, while developing and implementing problem-solving methods for the descendants of enslaved and colonized African people globally. And we use Neely Fuller's archetype of the 9 areas of human activity to do so: economics, education, entertainment, labor, law, politics, religion, sex, war, counter-war. Black social theory is simply a term. It's not new. It's not something that was just invented. It's just a term to more or less categorize pre-existing ideas and practices that people of African descent have been using for resistance for all the time that we've been in this condition. And this is on a global scale. We're not trying to more or less act like we reinvented the wheel. We're trying to more or less put the wheels together and add a motor to it. It's a centralized perspective of the diverse methods and concepts of resistance, as well as the effort for liberation and problem solving for Black people globally. And Black people, again, with the capital B, the proper adjective. We're talking about those that are rejecting white supremacy as it's been defined. Black social theory consists of 3 core components. And this is a very important aspect of the lecture. The 3 components are Black consciousness, Black collectivism, and holistic Pan-Africanism. The internet is probably one of the most treacherous places in the world for misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. Again, we have to define the terms according to exactly what we mean by them. So in these terms, people have used them perhaps in other contexts, but the way that we're defining them here is the way that we mean them, and they can't be convoluted with another interpretation. Each version needs to have its own specific understanding and definition, so that when we use these terms, we're not speaking in abstractions and generalizations. Black social theory identifies oppositional paradigms based on this idea that either you assimilate or you dissimilate. There's no confusion about what the agenda is. And in between those two, I would also add, conformity does not represent assimilation or dissimilation. In other words, if you still spend the currency with former slave masters on it, that doesn't mean you've assimilated psychologically. It means you conformed to the system that you live in. Assimilation and dissimilation in this context, it's really a reflection of the psychological perspective that your entire understanding of the world is rooted in. These devices that we use because we're in this particular society does not mean that there's a contradiction of our purpose. And that's the reality of our ancestors. To even come up with something like the Underground Railroad, which you're dealing with the context of your circumstance and how you must address it. And there's different variations of that, whether it be David Walker or Nat Turner. Those are similar but different in many ways. David Walker emphasized our psychological and intellectual reprogramming, whereas Nat Turner took straight to arms. Now, both of those could be useful in different contexts, but we want to be clear that conformity in and of itself does not reject either of those perspectives. It simply says there's a time and place for everything. So we see the term Black consciousness. First and foremost, you have to give credit to Frantz Fanon in his book, Black Skin, White Mask. He uses the term Black consciousness. We expand on it in our definition, and we expand on it by simply saying Black consciousness is the cognitive framework or way of thinking that Black people that absolutely reject and resist the paradigm of white supremacy use in all forms and all practices with an intention to dismantle all systems of white supremacy. So it is a complete rejection of white supremacy. supremacy, as white supremacy has been defined. Black consciousness is also the reclamation of the most effective and useful aspects of African epistemology, which is basically philosophy, ontology, which is how you generate knowledge, axiology, which is your values, and semiotics, which are signs and symbols. Now, it's reclaiming those because they are much older than white supremacy, but those most functional aspects can be repurposed for problem solving and the restoration of Black people that have been enslaved, colonized, and oppressed by the prevailing hegemony of white supremacy. Black consciousness also, it's a historical knowledge of African achievement and the assertion of collective potential, positive identity formation, and interpersonal accountability. It's rooted in a way of thinking that transcends borders. It transcends any perspective that is tertiary to freedom, justice, and equality for Black folks. Now, that doesn't mean that every behavior and every practice falls under this category. If it cannot be connected to direct problem solving for the condition that has been imposed by white supremacy, then it is of no use to Black folks. This means that the idea of intersectionality and all these other things that came more or less during the 1970s, these are not aspects of Black consciousness. Critical race theory is not an aspect of Black consciousness. Critical race theory in and of itself was introduced as a form of litigation for violation of civil rights legislation. That's what it was. It was something that was invented by attorneys. Now, you can extend Black consciousness to develop processes in the courts, but let's not confuse these ideas. Black consciousness is not trying to find a way to intersect or connect another struggle with the struggle of Black folks. That's not what it is. And that's an important aspect of this definition of Black consciousness. Now, someone else can define it in a different way, and we have the benefit of looking at the term as it was used by Stephen Biko, who summarizes that Black consciousness is not just based on your skin color, as he says in his work very clearly, and he expresses an idea that it's a way of thinking, and we see that also in Frantz Fanon and all of the other elders that we've had over the last 200 years, even going back as far as David Walker's work. The old saying, all skin folk and kinfolk, is defined in the terms Black consciousness. Now, what is Black collectivism? Black collectivism is the code of conduct by which your relationships, whether they be interpersonal or communal or even institutional, and as well as systemic relationships, it's how you structure them and how they're maintained, and they're rooted in the cognitive framework of Black consciousness. Everything comes from a way of thinking. What is the end goal? What is it that we seek to achieve building these relationships? It has to be rooted in Black consciousness for it to be Black collectivism. It's rooted in principles of reciprocity, justice, harmony, balance, and this one is important, conflict resolution. Conflict resolution is perhaps the most important aspect of Black consciousness and Black collectivism and holistic Pan-Africanism. Whether that conflict be at the geopolitical level, whether it be at the economic level, or whether it be at the interpersonal level, or whether it's at the internal level, we must resolve the conflict to move forward as a collective. And with that comes a collective accountability for the purpose of building an egalitarian social system, which means simply something that's fair for everybody. Freedom, justice, and equality for the whole human family. But we got to start with ourselves first. And we have to model it as the mothers and fathers of the human family. It's our duty to represent what the human family should be doing through our own ways and actions. So the Black family in this context is the primary and most essential institution of Black collectivism. Mother, father, child. And often people get into debates and discussions about the concept of marriage and feminism and all of these different things that are really residual effects of our oppression. At the end of the day, whether we have an ideal scenario or whether we are striving for it, we still need to have objectives and goals. The objective is mother, father, child is the nucleus of Black collectivism. The ability for a mother and father to be of one accord in the context of Black consciousness and to raise their child in that same mind frame and model the behavior in the household, and then to have communities rooted in this same practice consider this. Who will your children marry? If they're not marrying like-minded people, then how do you maintain this paradigm of Black collectivism? If it falls off after one generation, it doesn't mean anything. So that means that it's not just about mother, father, child in your household. It's the idea that oftentimes we might have to become the mother or father of children that aren't ours biologically. We have to see ourselves as being connected to those people that are descendants of our ancestors as we are. And in doing so, building that family structure where the roles of the mother and the father are clearly defined and rooted in our purpose as Black people seeking freedom, justice, and equality. This is an extremely important aspect. We'll do future lectures where we'll deconstruct the sexual revolution, which rejects the so-called idea of the nuclear family, which is in opposition to Black collectivism. Any idea that suggests that the Black woman, the Black man, and Black child are not a package deal is not a representation of Black consciousness or Black collectivism. So when we ask these questions, we always have to make sure that we have a purpose, that we're leading to something. So when we say, what is holistic Pan-Africanism? Pan-Africanism has been a term used and thrown around since W.E.B. Du Bois. And I would say he does not represent holistic Pan-Africanism. Holistic Pan-Africanism particularly is the perspective that Black people are all connected to the continent of Africa and its diaspora through the cognitive framework of Black consciousness, Black collectivism, and genetics. Now, what does that mean? That means that all skin folk ain't kinfolk. Just because you're from Africa, just because you have Black skin, doesn't mean that we are connected. We are connected through the cognitive framework of Black consciousness, Black collectivism, and genetics. So this eliminates the question of, I'm not Black, but I have Black consciousness and I believe in Black. No, you got to have the genetics too. So this connects the dots so that we're not just talking about an abstract idea. We're talking about a way of thinking and a debt to the ancestors that we manifest on a global scale. And we're not just limiting it to the continent of Africa. We're looking at this as to say, well, our origin is on that continent, but we are a global people. Hence Black globalism. Holistic Pan-Africanism is the agenda to liberate Africa from the exploitation of systems of white supremacy and its agents, regardless of who they may be. We have to have a holistic perspective of Pan-Africanism, all skin folk and kinfolk. Within the paradigm of Black consciousness, we have the reclamation of African epistemology, ontology, axiology, and semiotics. And in that regard, we have a holistic Pan-Africanism. And this is different than just saying Pan-Africanism. There are African unions right now that exist that are Pan-African, but they don't represent these ideals. ECOWAS does not represent what we're describing here. So we're talking about something different than perhaps what others may have used as terminology in the past. This is a unique perspective. The emphasis is that we understand the value of the people of the continent of Africa, as well as the value of the land that we call the continent of Africa. All of that being said, it still comes back to mind over matter. So one of the things that before we get into this next section of our lecture, we want to make something clear. Those of us that are descendants of enslaved and colonized African people globally, we all don't think the same. So therefore, the objective is not to make the sweeping generalization that everyone should be doing this or that. The idea presented through Universal University is for those that see it in this context. If this context resonates with you and you understand it and it makes sense, then we are like-minded. If you disagree, then this is not for you. So it's not an example of, hey, everybody, you should do this. This is about making the call to those that understand it in this way. To address these differences of opinion that are oftentimes polar opposite in this context, we've developed a paradigm called the Kunta Kinte / Toby dichotomy. And this particular paradigm addresses the psychological effects of chattel slavery and eventually colonization. And in that regard, we address the fact that chattel slavery in and of itself begins in the 15th century with the very first experiences of African people being kidnapped and enslaved, being taken to Europe, but the mass enslavement of Africans in what we call the Mafa or the transatlantic slave trade, the Middle Passage, the triangular trade, all of these terms describe how African people were captured, enslaved, and brought to the Western Hemisphere. And in that process, often what is neglected is the seasoning process. Now, the seasoning process is perhaps the most essential aspect of chattel slavery for it to be a sustainable practice for over 400 years. In doing so, this was a form of what psychologists call operant conditioning, which is basically reward and punishment. In other words, you reward a behavior that you want the subject to reproduce, and you punish behaviors that you don't want the subject to reproduce. So in this seasoning process, it was hyper violent. You probably have heard the term buck breaking, which is just another synonym for seasoning. And Europeans particularly used this methodology to more or less brainwash enslaved African people, because the enslaved African person, the first objective was always to be free and go home. So slave rebellions, revolutionary actions that we see in Haiti are a reflection of the enslaved African person's desire for freedom was often greater than their fear of death. So to address this, what you saw throughout the entire time that the Western Hemisphere was colonized, first by Spain and Portugal, and then later the British, the French as well. You even had some Dutch and other European groups that participated. But what you saw was a process to psychologically program enslaved African people to prevent them from rebelling and fighting back. The seasoning process was reward and punishment. So submission to the so-called slave master was rewarded. Any type of resistance, which included the retention of African language, the retention of African cultural practices, any type of identity that did not filter through the so-called slave master, was punished with extreme violence. The purpose of this is to essentially erase any form of an African consciousness in enslaved African people. The logic was that if you erase the African consciousness and make the enslaved African person dependent upon the so-called slave master, then they would work and put forth effort as if they were doing it for God Almighty. The logic of the seasoning process is to defeat the mind, and then the body would follow. It's also important to note that this system of psychological programming never stopped, even after chattel slavery ended. And it's important to understand that this seasoning process was very effective, but it never was effective to the point where all enslaved African people would just give in to this form of operant conditioning. There was always going to be resistance, even in light of the seasoning process. And there's another aspect that's important to identify as well. This understanding of seasoning or buck breaking continues even in the 21st century. Take a look at this excerpt from the film Roots by Alex Haley. And this provides a very accurate depiction of the seasoning process as it begins. What you're seeing is an enslaved African person from the Senegambia by the name of Kunta Kinte has been captured and brought to the Americas, and he's still in his African mind. So his objective is to go home, retain his identity, and to figure out how to achieve his freedom. At the same time, you have a Negro that has been seasoned, a character called Fiddler, that operates in the interest of the so-called slave master in an attempt to erase the African consciousness from the enslaved African person. So take a look at this and we'll just see a quick example of what seasoning would look like. And it would be much worse than this, but this is sufficient to give you the idea.
Sarah's Fiddler, that's me. Now you say, Toby. Kunta Kinte. No, that's your African name. Must have give you a new name. No, that's your African name. Must have give you a new name. No, that's your African name. Must have give you a new name. Must have say, you name Toby. Hey, what's the matter with you? Cut me loose. Kunta Kinte. You Africans all alike. Crazy. Must have say you name is Toby. That's who you is. He own you. He can do anything he want with you. There ain't nothing you can do about it. Yeah. Sure hope you learn fast so I don't have to keep bringing your victual down here. Then you can eat in the cookhouse. Take them chains off you. Things start looking better once you stop being African. Start being nigger like the rest of us. Things start looking better once you stop being African. Start being nigger like the rest of us. Things start looking better once you stop being African. Start being nigger like the rest of us. Go on, boy. Them prime grits there. Can you say grits?
James, your name is Toby. I want to hear you say it. Your name is Toby. You're going to learn to say your name. Let me hear you say it. What's your name?
Kunta Kinte.
When the master gives you something, you take it. He gave you a name. It's a nice name. It's Toby. And it's going to be yours till the day you die. Now, I know you understand me, and I want to hear it. Again! I want to hear you say your name. Your name is Toby. What's your name?
Kunta. Lord God help that boy. They're gonna whip him dead.
What's your name? Say it. Toby. Who are you? Say your name. What's your name?
Toby.
Hi. Say it again. Say it louder so they all can hear you. What's your name?
Toby. My name is Toby.
Hi. That's a good nigger. Cut him down.
Of course, that's a movie, so the level of violence that we see is quite intense. However, we have to be mindful that the actual violence that occurred on plantation was this to the nth power. Now, when we talk about the Kunta Kinte / Toby dichotomy, there's a couple of basic principles that repeat themselves in future lectures and in the ideas that the Universal University presents. It argues that non-white people have two basic psychological responses to the paradigm of white supremacy: assimilation or dissimilation. So assimilation is more or less the character fiddler. So that means that you're going along with the reward for sustaining the system of white supremacy in any context. By doing so, you understand this might be your means of survival, this might be your means of prosperity, prestige, fame, whatever the reward is. In doing so, you also regurgitate the ideas and paradigms embedded in white supremacy, and there are many different variations. Oftentimes, people like to use these dialectics. Dialectic is basically a thesis, an antithesis, and then the synthesis. So a simple way to explain it is good cop and then the bad cop. In this dialectic, the bad cop is the thesis. In this metaphor, we're saying, okay, the bad cop is out to hurt you. He's going to do you harm. He's not going to give you justice. He's just there to abuse you. And then you have the antithesis, which is the good cop. And the idea is, oh, well, the good cop is going to help you. The good cop is going to serve a purpose to make sure that there's justice for you and that you'll be okay and everything will work out fine. The synthesis is the good cop and the bad cop work together. They're going to lock you up. How they do it is through this dialectic of thesis and antithesis. But the synthesis of both is you getting arrested. So what happens oftentimes in terms of white supremacy supremacy, there's often this Hegelian dialectic of white supremacy that says, oh, the right-wing conservative white people are the racists, but the left-wing liberal white folks are the good guys. Malcolm X talks about this. He even uses the metaphor of the wolf and the fox. This idea that, oh, you think the wolf is the bad guy because it howls, it's letting you know what it's going to do, whereas the fox has a smile on its face, but it still wants to do the same thing as the wolf. This is the context when we analyze assimilation. Oftentimes, there's this belief in some form of white supremacy that is noble or good, when the hegemony of white supremacy is rooted in a left and a right that work together. There's no bird that flies without a left and right wing. Within the context of this Kunta Kinte Toby dichotomy, that idea is rejected. The left wing of white supremacy is no good, and the right wing of white supremacy is no good. And to be able to deconstruct and understand that assimilation does not just appear as Uncle Ruckus in that cartoon, it's also in the regurgitation of ideas like the sexual revolution that says that the nuclear family must be destroyed. This idea that there's a gender war between black men and black women. These are still tenets of white supremacy, regardless of whether they're represented by the left or the right. When we say assimilation, we're very clear. We're not talking about a particular political view in a vacuum. We're saying that if it does not produce freedom, justice, and equality for the human family as a whole, then it is useless. So therefore, we do not just analyze it from a political lens, which oftentimes is what you'll find. We see that assimilationists are often social integrationists. They're often those that see any attempt to focus on black folks is too radical. And then they advocate the prioritization of changing the minds of white folks or seeking allies, where the priority in this context is we must fix ourselves and then the world will follow our lead. So assimilation does not follow that path. Assimilation says that it must be some form of white folks that is the answer to our problems, whether on the left or the right. So desimilation is the opposite of that. And essentially, this is saying there's an absolute rejection of white supremacy, the left or the right, and rejecting the attempts at operant conditioning. Sometimes the reward punishment tactic, you will suffer. You may not get the opportunities that you deserve based on your merit because you have not decided to assimilate to the system of white supremacy. So dissimilation is saying that we understand reward and punishment, but we would rather choose the punishment if it means that we are doing the duty of our ancestors. So it's a very simple concept. However, the nuance of this dichotomy, when we peel back some of the layers in future lectures, this is the fundamental binary. And also the final aspect of it is when we talk about conformity, civic conformity simply means you pay your taxes, you obey the law. That is not assimilation. Assimilation is when you adopt the ideas of your oppressor as it relates to self-image, as it relates to nation building, as it relates to understanding history, as it relates to forming problem-solving strategies. It's not to say that we as citizens of a particular country don't obey the law. We have civic conformity. We obey the law. But it's just the same as saying, I don't have to believe in a white Jesus. I could be a Christian. I could believe in the Bible, but I don't accept the blue-eyed, blonde-haired white Jesus. Assimilationist will accept the blue-eyed, blonde-haired version of Jesus, even with evidence in the scriptures saying otherwise. That's the difference. The one area of assimilation and dissimilation that is the most profound is the mind. So the way that we think is a reflection of that black consciousness. Within the context of black consciousness, it is absolute dissimilation from ideologies of white supremacy. And we have to deconstruct every paradigm to get to the root of it to determine this process of dissimilation. The paradigm in and of itself is to address that if your way of thinking does not yield itself for freedom, justice, and equality for the human family, and more specifically, first and foremost, black folks globally, then you are assimilated. It's very simple. On this slide, we have examples of responses to white supremacy. Now, in future lectures, we're going to deconstruct these in detail. These are all worthy of unique lectures. These examples that we see here, we'll be elaborating on them in greater detail. So you get a sneak peek at what we're going to be discussing and how we'll analyze these responses of assimilation and dissimilation going forward. So now we've given a pretty clear definition of what exactly is Black globalism. And Black globalism is the combined practices and ideologies within the paradigm of Black social theory. And Black globalists are just those who subscribe and adhere to the paradigm of Black social theory. Now, in conclusion, we have two very important individuals, two of the 19th century pioneers of Black social theory, Black globalism. And there are probably others that maybe someone else would consider significant, but we want to focus in this introductory lecture on two individuals. We begin with David Walker and his appeal, written in 1829, and then we continue on with the works of Edward Woodman Blyden from 1856 to 1908. Now, we start off with David Walker and his work, Walker's Appeal, in 4 articles, together with a preamble to the colored citizens of the world, but in particular, and very expressly, to those of the United States of America. This is the beginning of our intellectual foundations of Black social theory for many different reasons, right? There have been people that wrote pamphlets and books prior to this, but what David Walker offers us is something extremely unique that would be the blueprint for what occurs for the rest of the 19th century and well into the 20th and even 21st century. He was born in Wilmington, North Carolina, circa 1786. We say circa because once we start talking about the birth of Black folks all the way up to the 19th and even arguably the 20th century, the records aren't necessarily as accurate as we may see them to be today. But he was the child of an enslaved father and a free mother, which meant that the status of the mother is passed to the child, so he was born free. His influences included the Haitian Revolution, which is something we'll definitely be talking about in future lectures. Denmark Vesey, we'll also talk about him. The Bishop Richard Allen, we have to talk about him. The African Lodge, which is now known more popularly as the Prince Hall Masonic Lodge. He was also inspired by the Bible and African history. He was a member of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the AME Church, which is very significant in the 19th century for Black liberation movements. And he's also a member of the African Lodge, and he achieved something very impressive. He got his 33rd degree in less than 2 months. He traveled the eastern seaboard of the United States and settled in Boston. He owned a thrift store that sold used clothing to plantations. That's extremely significant because his pamphlet, his work, he smuggled it on the plantations by sewing it into secondhand clothing that so-called slave masters would purchase from him, and then he would end up having his pamphlet in the hands of enslaved African people. Now, let's just clarify something. Sometimes people say that, oh, well, enslaved African people couldn't read. Well, initially they were able to read if they were reading the Bible. There's a connection to that, to why Nat Turner, his belief in the Bible drove his actions because he read the Bible. So the real push to eliminate literacy on plantations is in part contributed to David Walker's Appeal, because David Walker's Appeal was considered the incendiary pamphlet. In this document, he motivated and inspired enslaved African people to fight for their freedom. He did not believe that there was any possibility of trying to reform the so-called slave masters. He believed the only means was to fight for it and take it in blood. So he's given in many contexts credit for so many slave rebellions that occurred prior to the Civil War. And he also provides the first literary analysis of American society from the cognitive framework of Black consciousness and Black globalism. In doing so, he deconstructs Thomas Jefferson's work, Notes to Virginia. He provides an extremely intelligent critique and exposes the hypocrisy of Thomas Jefferson by simply stating that if you say that you have 2 horses in a race and then you keep one of them in a cage and the other one runs free, and then you say the one runs free is faster. Essentially, he's exposing the hypocrisy of trying to attempt to claim that enslaved African people were inferior by simply stating if you put people in this type of a condition, it is not realistic to assume that they will achieve as much as those that are not in this condition. So he also develops the foundations of Black collectivism, holistic Pan-Africanism, and Black militancy. When we say holistic Pan-Africanism, the very title of the work, he says to the world. And then he says expressly to those in the United States, but he's speaking to colored people of the world. And this is very significant because he understands the circumstance of Black folks is a global issue, even though he was born in Wilmington, North Carolina. Now, his Black militancy is transparent. He's very much trying to get active. He doesn't believe in respectability politics. He's not trying to prove he's worthy. He believes that it must be taken in blood. In doing so, he also invokes the
glory of African civilizations from antiquities, which oftentimes people use the term Hotep as a derogatory, which is really a deep sign of assimilation. That is Sambo Negro type activity. But David Walker, during chattel slavery in 1829, describes how black folks built the pyramids and enlightened the Greeks. He uses these examples of African greatness to inspire enslaved African people in the Americas. This is extremely significant. This was also some of the rhetoric that was more popular in the African Lodge, but oftentimes when we talk about those type fraternal organizations, much of it is secret. So he's making this idea available to enslaved African people on plantations. You have to be mindful, not long before this document was written, Napoleon had just went to Egypt and started to really see those inhabitants of the Nile Valley were black. He's already addressing this by 1829. And this is extremely significant because as we look at it, we're talking about a people that are enslaved and you're telling them they built the greatest civilization of all time, meaning that potential is in you. Even though you're in chains now, you can lose those chains and return to a state of glory. This is powerful, even in the 21st century, but to put it in the context of the 19th century during chattel slavery, we can't understate how important this is. He also invokes a historical and contemporary analysis of slavery and the perceived hypocrisy of slavery practiced by Christians. So he's a Christian and he's saying that the version of Christianity that the European practices in America is a hypocrisy and is not authentic. It is not a representation of the Christ. It is a representation of the devil. So he's starting to form what we now understand to be called Black liberation theology as well. But he's combining it with all the other elements of Black social theory. It's not just one dimensional. He's giving every aspect of it with a state of militancy, which means no compromise. So he's a major influence on the ideologies of Black consciousness, not just in the 19th century, but even to this moment. We can look at one of his quotes. On the 22nd page of the appeal, he says, "When we take retrospective of the arts and sciences, the wise legislators of the pyramids and other magnificent buildings, the turning of the channel of the river Nile by the sons of Africa or of Ham, among whom learning originated and was carried thence into Greece where it was improved upon and refined, thence among the Romans and all over the then enlightened parts of the world, and it has been enlightening the dark and benighted minds of men from then down to this day. I say, when I view retrospectively the renown of that once mighty people, the children of our great progenitor, I am indeed cheered. Yea, further, when I view that mighty son of Africa, Hannibal, and one of the greatest generals of antiquity, who defeated and cut off so many thousands of the white Romans or murderers, and who carried his victorious arms to the very gate of Rome, and I give it as my candid opinion that had Carthage been well united and him given good support, he would have carried that barbarous city by storm. But they were disunited, as the colored people are now in the United States of America. The reason our natural enemies are enabled to keep their feet on our throats." So David Walker is very important in our understanding of the intellectual progress of our people in addressing white supremacy and understanding who we were before chattel slavery, and even understanding that this does not just begin and end even in West Africa. He's invoking the Nile Valley. He's understanding a commonality of all of Africa, which is really giving you an understanding of what we mean by holistic Pan-Africanism. Most of the time you find this negative connotation of someone that lives in West Africa invokes the value of the Nile Valley that they don't know and understand. No, that's not how it works, because we are people that have migrated, and we migrated, ironically, from that Nile Valley through the rest of the continent of Africa and even to the world. So David Walker addressing this and connecting these dots in 1829 is extremely significant. And just to make the point that if you've not read his work, it is essential reading to put things in context. Now, the next gentleman that we'll briefly analyze is Edward Wilmot Blyden. Now, Edward Wilmot Blyden came a little later, close to the end of the 19th century, but he's still extremely significant and important. And the omission of others that you may feel are important and have contributions, which many do, the omission was not as a slight to them. What is most important, however, is to address those that brought something that was pioneering. So pioneering efforts are those that we can say, this is a new frontier, this is a new way of thinking that brings us to a point where we can add on onto it and advance the cause for problem solving. And Edward Wilmer Blyden is definitely in that category. He's born on August 3rd, 1832 in St. Thomas, which is currently the U.S. Virgin Islands. He's the third of 7 children born to Romeo and Judith Blyden, a tailor and a school teacher. Both of his parents were free and literate. At that time, most black folks in that region were enslaved and illiterate. He's already starting off advantaged in many ways. He was heavily involved in the Dutch Reformed Church. He had aspirations to pursue a career as a theologian, and he attempted to enroll in the Rutgers Theological College in New Jersey, and he couldn't get in because he was black. And in January of 1851, he traveled to Liberia to teach at the Alexander High School in Monrovia. Now, this is significant because during this time period, the American Colonizational Society was attempting to more or less repatriate African people out of the United States and send them to Liberia. So he initially engages in this endeavor. However, he arrives in Africa and has an experience that changes his entire life perspective. Now, as mentioned before, he was heavily involved in the Christian church as a youth, and he grew up in an environment even wanting to become a theologian. But once he got to Africa and he started to meet African scholars of Islam, he started to realize that the mythology that he had heard so much in the Western Hemisphere about African people being savages and running around in the jungle and things of that nature were just lies to more or less make black folks think that they had nothing but savages to claim as their own, while Western Europeans make this mythology that somehow people that are descendants of ancient British or so-called French or Germanic people, somehow they were connected to the Greeks, which is absurd. So he makes a 180 from his perspective as he initially attempts to go to Liberia as more or less a missionary. Once he changes his perspective, you see here, he writes several books: A Voice from Bleeding Africa, A Vindication of the African Race, A Brief Examination of the Arguments in Favor of African Inferiority, Negro in the Ancient World, Africa for the Africans, Christianity, Islam, and the Negro Race. Now, this particular work is extremely significant because Edward Wilmer Blyden pioneered black liberation theology through Islam. He argued that Islam was the more natural religion, not only for African people on the continent of Africa, but also enslaved African people in the Americas. He argued that that was a more natural and organic faith for African people globally. Through this understanding, he begins to dissect the effects of Christianity as it was presented by Europeans, not only just the Americas as a whole, but even in Europe as well as Africa, as missionary efforts in Africa started to accelerate as we move toward that fateful Berlin Conference in 1884. Also in this work, in the process of examining the effects of Christianity on African people, he analyzed the psychological effects of chattel slavery and the seasoning process. This is pioneering work. This is in the 19th century. This is less than 30 years after chattel slavery. He's examining the effects on the mind of enslaved African people even after chattel slavery. This is a new frontier because we see that black people are taking hold of what exactly has happened to them and beginning to deconstruct it to better develop problem-solving strategies. So he developed a paradigm of African consciousness in opposition to assimilation to white supremacy. He's credited for understanding that this framework that we've introduced called assimilationism was something that was problematic, and he connects it to the seasoning process. Just to examine some of the more significant quotes of Edward Wilmer Blyden to put his work into context, it's important that you read these works yourself, but we just want to point it out to get people to understand that this isn't hyperbole. This is the work that was being done in the 19th century. So we have his work, Christianity, Islam, and the Negro Race, page 88, and he says, "In all English-speaking countries, the mind of the intelligent Negro child revolts against the descriptions given in elementary books, geographies, travels, histories of the Negro. But though he experiences an instinctive revulsion from these caricatures and misrepresentations, he is obliged to continue, as he grows in years, to study such pernicious teachings. After leaving school, he finds the same things in newspapers, in reviews, in novels, in quasi-scientific works, and after a while, sape cadendo, they begin to seem seem to him the proper things to say and to feel about his race, and he accepts what, at first, his fresh, unbiased feelings naturally and indignantly repelled. Such is the effect of repetition. Having embraced or at least assented to these errors and falsehoods about himself, he concludes that his only hope of rising in the scale of respectable manhood is to strive after whatever is most unlike himself and most alien to his peculiar taste. So, as we can see, Edward Wilmot Blyden is addressing the psychological impact of chattel slavery and the conditioning that had been imposed upon enslaved African people. In doing so, he represents what we really understand Black consciousness to be. That process of deprogramming and reprogramming is necessary for all of us. No one got away. Regardless of what we believe of ourselves and our egos, we are somehow all impacted by the endeavors of white supremacy. And the work that it takes to address how we as individuals have been affected and how we have been affected as a collective are the day-to-day labor of a Black globalist. So what we introduced in the previous sections of this lecture are essentially just echoing the works of Edward Wilmot Blyden and others that have come after him. So it demonstrates that what we consider to be Black social theory, Black globalism, it is not a new invention. It is not an idea that just fell out the sky. This is the work of our ancestors that those of us that have come after them have an opportunity to contribute to and add to. So we are all contributing, but in the real scope of things, this begins way before we were even born. We're talking about from David Walker to Edward Wilmot Blyden to now a period of almost 200 years. In conclusion, these are the 20th century pioneers of Black globalism. We gave the primary two between David Walker and Edward Wilmot Blyden, but in the 20th century, there's also significant pioneers, some of which we mentioned in the comparison of responses to white supremacy in our section on assimilation and dissimilation with the Kunta Kinte/Toby dichotomy. And we start with Marcus Garvey, Master Fard, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, the Negritude Movement, Doc Ben, Dr. John Henry Clark, Cheonta Diop, Frantz Fanon, Neely Fuller, Dr. Francis Cress Welsing, Stephen Bantu Biko, Dr. Amos Wilson, Dr. Naeem Akbar. There's many more in the 20th century that really just demonstrate the impact of what our ancestors did in the 19th century. It exploded in the 20th century. We will analyze these works and many, many more, as well as other topics that are relevant to Black folks globally. For those that are interested in the sources that we use for today's lecture, be sure to check the bibliography that's located in the description section on the platforms that we post this work.
And that concludes episode 0 of Universal University. Stay tuned as we will go further and further on the journey of knowledge, wisdom, and understanding for the purpose of problem solving for our people. Peace.